Hi everyone, it's Ecepta. I hope you're all doing well. I just released a new track called Euphoria, and I thought since we're all in quarantine right now, it might be cool to show you the project file and explain some things about how I work and what I do and what I did to make this song work. So for the people that haven't heard the track yet, I'll just play a little section of the drop so that you'll know what I'll be talking about. So let's start here at the top with the drums. The first sound from the drum section is the kick that I want to explain. So this kick consists of two individual parts, the top kick and the sub kick. The top kick sounds like this, and the sub sounds like this together. So how I made this was I used this kick sample from an Origin Sound sample pack, and I used the pogo function in the FL Studio sampler and the clip function as well. So the pogo function is basically a pitch envelope where the pitch starts really high and then it goes down while the sound plays, and that gives it a bit more punch, a bit more attack, and it also makes the sound a bit higher. And a very important part of the sound is this clipping, so I boosted this by 45-ish%, and I used the clip mode so that it's basically distorting really hard, and you see this square kind of waveform. So that's what I did there, and I'll just remove these effects. That's what that sounds like. Then I added a sub kick, which is basically this dry sound. Didn't change too much about that, and together it does that, and then I just process them together to make it fit a bit better. So I turned down the high end to make it fit better in the mix down. I added a convolution, which is kind of a reverb, but it has a bit more character and you can be more creative with it. And that adds a bit of a tail. It's quite a long tail actually. I wouldn't recommend that in a lot of cases, but right now it worked. Then I distorted it a bit. It's a pretty specific shape. I don't remember why I did this exactly, but it sounds cool. Then a limiter to make sure it's not peaking, and this Edison recorder doesn't really do anything. I might have recorded a kick. Yeah, I recorded this kick and put it in a sample folder that I made. So that's not important. So okay, usually when I work on drums, I get the most important sounds, I put them in first. So the next sound I would make is a snare clap rim shot kind of sound, and usually I work from the top to the bottom per group. So the kick is the first drum sound that I made, and then usually I would have a snare or rim shot or clap here, but I actually replaced that and added a new one later. So I'll just continue with explaining this rim sound. It's not that special. It's from a sample pack that I made but never released, and it's pretty dry. I just distorted it a bit and EQ to make it fit better in the mix down. So then the next sounds are this percussion sample that's stretched and pitched up a bit, and a tambourine sample. These are just one shots and kind of speak for themselves. Then I wanted a sound that accents the 16th note pattern. So that's a pretty basic percussion one shot. And then I did a bunch of weird effects to make it move a little bit, make it more interesting. So there's an auto pen which makes the sound go from the left speaker to the right speaker. There's a phaser which gives it a bit of a weird filtered phaser kind of sound. And I automated the mode, which is, if you know how a phaser works, it's a bunch of notch filters that are moving together. And this mode knob, I believe, adds more notch filters. So I made this go up, and it drastically changes the timer of the sound. So yeah, here you can really hear the difference. With the mode all the way up, it's pretty resonant and weird, and down here it's more, it feels more like just an EQ basically. So then there's this fill snare. And at the end of every section, you hear this snare to kind of introduce or let the listener know that there's a new part coming. That consists of 2 layers, also from this Origin sound pack. I just downloaded that, so I used a bunch of sounds from it. This is the most important layer, and I pitched it up. So it sounds like that. And some processing, just a bit of this. That doesn't really do anything. This is hard clipping basically, but it doesn't push the input volume. And a bit of EQ. Then I like this percussion sound that's playing 16th notes, but I thought it was missing some white noise part of it. So I made this white noise shaker. I actually had a sound design session a few months ago where I made a bunch of different really textured noise sounds. I can play, yeah, those are here. So that's a bunch of different white noise processed in different ways and resampled, and just did some random effects on white noise, and you can get really cool textures if you use weird plugins. So I made a folder in the noise oscillator in Serum so that I can layer all those white noise samples to the sounds that I make and make them more textured. But right here, the only thing I did was I added this volume LFO to make it have this rhythm, and then it plays together and it blends pretty nicely with this 16th percussion. And then for the first part of the drop, I wanted the rim shot to fit in a bit better because it was really jumping out of the mix. So a cool trick that I like to do is have vinyl and crunchy Foley samples, and yeah, basically give it a volume automation like this so that it goes up right before the snare, and then when the snare or rim shot or clap hits, the volume goes down again, kind of like a tail. So it introduces the feeling of a clap or snare coming, and then it basically acts like a till as well. And that's really important in this part because it really makes the rim shot blend way better with the whole track. So that's basically all the drums. Then the funny thing is, halfway through the drop there is a switch up, and usually with variations in the drums you would add things. So you would add another sound, add another hi-hat. But for this song, for some reason, it worked way better to just take those away, and that's all the variation that's happening in the drop, as well as this automation. But yeah, I found that pretty interesting. Then here in the end, I'm just adding a reverb to everything and filtering this shaker out, and then there's this kick impact. So that's all there is to the drums. I didn't do any processing, so this group just everything goes here, I believe, and then it gets hard clipped together to make it have less peaks when it's going into the limiter. So that's basically all I'm doing there. So there's no compression on the whole drum group or stuff like that going on. Next thing I can talk about is the bass. There's only one bass sound in this song. It sounds like that. So how I did that, usually I would just go for a Reese like this. So I would pick a serum, make a saw wave, detune it a bit, and then add a low pass. That's how you could make a bass. But for this song, I wanted to have something a bit more specific. I wanted to let the bass go along with the percussion groove as well as this arpeggio melody. So that's basically the 16th note rhythm that I was talking about earlier. I wanted to have that in the bass as well. So what I did, I had two sine waves that are 1 octave apart. Then the sine wave on top is detuned a bit, and both of them are going into this LFO, where it's basically controlling the volume. So every 16th note, the volume of both of them go up, and they go into a distortion together. So this distortion adds a lot of more harmonics. And then there's this other 16th note LFO going to the drive on the distortion. So that's basically what creates that 16th note rhythm. For the processing, it's just a bit of EQing. So basically it's higher notes from the sub bass sound louder to us than the lower notes. And it's because of a physics phenomenon called Fletcher-Munson effect. And basically with a lot of bass sounds, I try to bring that back to normal a bit, so that the higher notes sound as if they are the same loudness as the lower notes. So I'm boosting the lower sub bass and turning down the higher sub bass a bit. Then there's a bit of a reverb filter from Serum Effects on it to make the high end a bit more textured, and probably low end a bit fatter as well. It's not that important. Then some distortion that's really subtle. and some more EQing. It looks like I brought down the sub again, so this EQ doesn't really do that much. And then I made it quieter with this limiter. So during this little build-up part in the drop, that sounds like this. I added this high pass filter and this distortion, warm tape distortion. That's really, the drive is all the way up, and that's adding a lot of more harmonics. So when the sub bass completely disappears, you will still hear that bass note because of the harmonics that the distortion creates. And then there's another high pass again in the end to make it fade out more smoothly. So for the next group of sounds, I will talk about the synth pads and instruments. So it starts out with this, this is the most important sound in the track, this arpeggio. And as you can see, the MIDI is really complex. I wanted this song to have kind of deadmau5 style arp sound with the 16th note flow and interesting chord progressions. And I wanted this arp to never repeat. So there's only one pattern in this whole song, and it never repeats a section. So apart from the beginning, so this section is repeating a few times, and then there's this new note added on top of the bass melody. So it's forming chords, and then more notes are added, and there's a new arp melody on top of everything with a different rhythm. And that rhythm is repeating, but every time it repeats, it's 1/16th note later than you would expect it to be. So a more logical rhythm for this higher melody would be this. But I'm not doing that. I'm having it repeat like this. So every time you hear it, it's on a different part of the rhythm. And that also causes for a cool kind of harmonic and melodic movement where nothing repeats during this whole track. And then whenever a repeating section would come in, like here, the arp melody underneath changes, as well as the timing of the arp on top. So this compared to this is still pretty different. And then during this part, the arp goes even higher. And yeah, that's basically it. So this sound was made using Serum again. I love Serum. I use it on basically everything. So this is two waveforms, a sine wave and a triangle wave, and both of them transition into more of a saw wave kind of sound by having this macro linked to, here it's the band plus, and here it's the wavetable position. So this is a basic wavetable that I made. It's a sine wave and a saw wave, and I morphed them so that this is happening. So whenever the macro opens, it's more of a saw wave timbre. And then there's also this low pass filter that's linked to this LFO, and that's giving it that kind of plucky sound, and it's also linked to the volume of all of the oscillators. And macro is linked to the cutoff position of those of the filter. So whenever the cutoff is low, like there, the whole sound basically consists of sine wave and triangle waves. And then whenever it goes up, it has way more of a saw wave timbre. So to give it a more interesting sound, I used a phaser and a chorus. And for the processing, there's some soft tape distortion, some EQing. The sound was really difficult to get right in a low mid area, because when the macro is all the way down, it's basically just a lot of sine waves playing together in this area, and it's very resonant there. So I tried to control that with a dynamic EQ, and later on with this really intense weird EQ setting as well. And here some more too. And this is another plugin that I wanted to talk about. So this is Cassette, and it's a pretty cool tape emulation kind of plugin. So it adds a bit of distortion and some pitch drift as well. So yeah, that's pretty cool. Other than that, there's a bit more compression to have a bit more control over everything. So then we have these sounds. And those are samples from the Virtual Riot ambience sample pack. And I just pitched them. This one I pitched it down one semitone. This one was pitched up one semitone. So I basically did that to make it not all just the raw samples. And yeah, that adds a lot to the atmosphere of the track, and I like to use samples like that to constantly have in the background and to give a bit more vibe to everything. And there's this sound. It's just a simple pad with a pitch bend on it. And this is something really cool I wanted to talk about. So this is I called it Cute Bell, because that was kind of how the sound started. It was a preset in Serum, and I kind of tweaked it a bit so that it was a bit different. It's a really basic sound, and it's not that interesting and textured, and I wasn't really quite sure what I thought of the sound, but I did some cool processing to make it a lot better. So this is a plugin Remnant, and that's a granular delay plugin. So it picks out a lot of slices from the sample and made it pitch up a bit, like 1 octave, and it's adding a lot of weird texture in the tail, and that's not something you would create by just using a regular delay or reverb. So this is what that sounds like. So you have that kind of beautiful bell texture 1 octave higher than the melody. Then I used Cassette again to give it that pitch drift and distortion. It's quite subtle, but definitely does something. And then this is the cool part of this processing. I used this Nectar 3 by Isotope, which is usually used for vocals. And the most important feature is probably this pitch feature, which is a autotune component of this plugin. And usually you would use that just to autotune vocals, but there's also this formant function down here. And formant is a effect that you would use on vocals as well, where you can change the sound of the vocal to make it sound higher or lower without changing the actual pitch. So that's pretty cool. But what I like to do is using features like this on sounds that it's not used for. and that creates really weird artifacts and really weird timbres and sounds that you would not hear anywhere else. So I shifted down like 6 or 7 semitones sound-wise, but the pitch stays the same. And the most important thing that you have here is the artifacts. So this is with the nectar. I'll just turn it up a bit. Sounds really weird and also really mono. And then this is without. This is a bit too sweet and too beautiful for my taste, and this is really textured and interesting. So that's what I did there. I EQ'd out the low end and added some reverb to bring back that stereo information again. Then there's this constant atmosphere in the background. And I made this probably by, I think it was just a random atmosphere sample that I placed in this granulizer plugin, and then with that granulizer I had more control over which part of the sample it's playing. So right now it's only playing snippets of this part, and I'm automating this position. So right now it's only playing this part, and then it goes right here in a bit. Yeah. So that's cool because you have a lot more control over the sound, and I didn't do much processing on this because it was kind of fine already. It sounded pretty good to me. Then in this part, this higher art melody stops, and I wanted to introduce a new sound. This one. That's just a bell I made in Serum. It's not that special. The downsample is pretty important to give that weird high end. And this is kind of taking over the role that this higher melody on the art had. And then it's building up. And then this new sound is added, which is really inspired by a quartet track from, I think it was Parallel something, I don't remember the name. So basically used 2 wavetables here and another file from the noise design, and that's really important for the character of the sound. And it's also having all these LFOs on the volume to give it that rhythm. Bit of EQing, mid-side EQing, and saturation. So yeah. Then the last sound from this group is this kalimba. And I really love this. This is probably my favorite part of the track, this outro, because first of all, I love kalimbas, and it's also the first time I use these sounds in this way. So what I did to make this, I downloaded a lot of organic tonal one-shots from freesound.org. So basically stuff like that, and I named them all so that I could find them easily. And then I made this pattern, and most notes are played by different samples, and that's what makes it so organic and so interesting and so textured. So there are 4 different kalimba sounds, and together they form that melody, and it kind of blends in a really cool way, where there's a lot of expression because all the notes sound different. So that's basically that. And then we can go to the vocal group. This is pretty simple. I just had this vocal sample that I liked, and I put this in the granulizer, and it sounds like this. And it's switching octaves every, I believe it's, yeah, every 16 bars there. It goes one octave higher and then one octave lower again. And I used a low pass filter to give it a bit more movement and make it fit more in the arrangement. So then the last part of this tutorial video is the effects section, and that's really simple as well. It starts out with this vinyl sample, just some vinyl crackle, and then right before the drop you have this granular fill. It's just a sample from a Mode Audio pack. That's the original sound, and then I used the pogo function again to give it that pitch envelope where it starts really high and goes down. So it does that, and every time you hear that sound in this song, you know that one bar after that something cool happens. So right here it's one bar before the drop, and then here it's one bar before the switch with a new synth, and here it's one bar before the kalimba sound. Then halfway through the drop a new vinyl sample gets added, and during the whole drop this cool, I'll make it a bit louder so you can hear it better. This really weird modular kind of bubble effect is playing during the whole track or during the whole drop to make it a bit more textured and interesting. So that's every sound in this whole song. It's pretty simple, but I like tracks where everything comes together really easily and everything just works for some reason. And yeah, it's the first time I've ever done a tutorial like this. So I hope this was interesting. If you want to see more of this, please let me know, and maybe till next time.